Hey there, Springs in the Desert. I am Jillian, your podcast host, and I am so excited to be with you today with one of our favorite returning guests, Clare Kane. How are you today, Clare?
I am well, thank you, Jillian. It's such a joy always to talk with you and to reflect on these things together. I'm so excited for today's conversation because I know it's been in discussion for a while.
Yes, yes. Listeners, we are just going to dive right in because this is a topic that I know I have a lot of questions about, and Clare has so much wisdom. And so today we're going to be talking about boundaries. And this is, I think, one of those kind of vocabulary words that's talked about a lot, but sometimes doesn't have great roots or understanding behind it. Or I think confusion about what does that mean? How do I do that? I like the idea of boundaries. I like that concept. And there's so many good books but to put it in
Yes.
practice and to really talk about it is what we're going to do today. So let's just start right at the beginning. What are boundaries, Clare?
Yeah, I think it's great that we're starting, yes, at ground zero. So, at the beginning of how this all works. So, boundaries are simply sort of rules and guidelines that we have for what we understand to be appropriate behavior. It's kind of like the limit, shall we say? It's kind of like
Mm,
if you want to think about it, how far in front of me, behind me, around me does my agency extend? Does that make sense? Like
mm,
the little bubble
yes.
around us, right? How far in front of me have I determined that it needs to extend? And what are sort of my standards against which I can measure what's appropriate behavior towards me and or towards someone else, right? And
Mm,
so I think that the word has become, I think, almost sometimes a throwaway phrase in pop psych, which is really
mm-hmm.
sad because boundaries really are the groundwork for safety and trust in relationships, right? Sort of setting a limit that this is sort of my personal autonomy here. This is my space and my space of agency. And when I come in relationship with someone else and I come and this person really seems to respect my space and my agency, the way I make decisions, right? The way what the limits I have set on what I want to share and what I don't, that kind of creates a sense of trust and that kind of builds community and communion with people when I know that
Mm,
they are respecting the limits I have set on my agency, right? How much I want to
mm.
share, don't want to share, how much I want to give, don't want to give.
That is really super helpful. And I appreciate that you explained agency a little bit too, because I think that sometimes it can be easy to feel like we don't have a say, that we do
Yeah.
like that are, maybe we have desires, preferences, real needs that need to be protected, but we don't feel like we can say to someone in our lives that that's what we need. And so I think, to maybe move on to that, we know what boundaries are, but with whom do we have them, right? Who can
Mm,
we set boundaries with in our lives?
mhm.
Can we have them with everyone? Do they look different with other people? What are your thoughts about that?
Oh yes, yeah, great questions. And yes, we set them with everyone. We set them with everyone, either consciously or unconsciously. And we do have different ones with different people. If you think about sort of within your own family, right? Maybe with your parents, right? The sort of level of emotional intimacy, sharing, decision making, right? Sort of the space you allow for someone else's opinion and agency to impact you is going to be
Hmm.
different than some stranger coming up to you in the supermarket and saying something that has an impact on your feelings about yourself or your decision making, right? So we set them with literally everyone around us, often unconsciously or consciously. Um, and the question often for people becomes, um, can I become, or is there a need maybe for me, an invitation here to become more intentional about setting them? Because some families in the curriculum, right, like, so you're raised by your caregivers. Some caregivers are very good about teaching kids how to set healthy boundaries, right? Because there are healthy boundaries and there are unhealthy boundaries, and those are on a spectrum between I have barbed wire fences between me and other people at all times, and I have no boundaries at all. My sense of self,
Hmm.
my sense of agency, my taking in of other people's opinions and letting them influence my sense of self is so porous that I'm kind of like
Hmm.
swayed by the wind in terms of how I understand myself and my own needs. So that's a spectrum, right? Nobody
Hmm.
can get in, everybody can get in, right? And so with each person, we kind of, I think many people intuitively set a boundary. The question as adults then becomes, am I finding a greater sense of freedom, stability in the boundaries I'm setting with certain people? Am I noticing that maybe with certain people in my family, my friends, my community, I'm having some sort of emotional reaction when I have interactions with them? Maybe there's a part of me that's feeling a bit trampled upon. Maybe I'm feeling intruded on. And perhaps I'm finding it harder to sort of set a boundary a little further out from myself, right? And
Mm,
the genesis of this kind of conversation, you and I here together, Jillian, when Anne and Kimberly were founding Springs in the Desert, when they were first having these conversations, was I was their classmate at the JP2 Institute, and we would have these conversations, you know, but very kindly, well-meaning people who would come up after mass and be like, "So when are you having? When are you having a baby? Why don't you have
mm,
any?" Right?
mm,
And then often these very, again, well-meaning, very sweet suggestions, many of which we had heard ad nauseum of, well, you should try this novena. You should try this, right? And I think there's maybe a growing sense of awareness now in the culture. There maybe wasn't so much, 15 years ago when we were studying, that some of that stuff is intrusive. Some of that, it really is intrusive, and it's kind of
mhm,
pushing on
mhm.
people who are already wounded. And so, what can we do as people who are carrying this cross of infertility and or pregnancy loss to sort of um, be healthy about what we allow in, and
Mm.
so that we can build greater trust and community with other people in a way that respects our autonomy and theirs.
You know, I have a question about the impact. You had talked just a few minutes ago about, when we that a boundary is helping us sort of decipher or make sure that there's an appropriate impact from the person, who's speaking. And I think we're going to get into this a little bit, but if someone is, let's say they have someone in their life and they are having these intrusive questions, and the impact that it's having on them, sort of the influence that those words and those actions are having, are really difficult, they're really maybe hurtful, what would sort of be the first step for someone to take if they're noticing that this
Mhm.
is like, this person and the words that they're saying are really impacting me in a negative way? Like, what could be the first step that someone would take?
That's great. Well, and I think you said the word. It's first is noticing, right? And
Hmm.
then it's sort of letting yourself sit with the feeling. That doesn't mean sort of feeding resentment or, maybe sort of assuming a sense of malice on this person's part, right? It literally just sit with the feeling like that didn't feel good. That interaction just didn't feel good. I felt, intruded upon, or, if if possible, I would have physically backed away from that conversation. I think it's important we pay attention to those sort of involuntary reactions. I think we've all been in those conversations regarding this topic or others where you're in conversation with someone and you start sort of edging away, right? I
Yep.
think that's
Yep.
important to pay attention. What is my body doing right now? Oh, it's attempting to have me leave, right? Like,
Yep.
okay, something is going on here. And I think the important thing is, I love this saying, and forgive me if I'm not remembering to whom it's attributed, but that the space for wisdom is in the pause. Like, if you start to
Mm.
feel that kind of thing, just take a little breath. You're like, okay, I'm feeling that. Doesn't mean I have to do anything with it, but it's okay for me to sort of get quiet for a second and allow myself to focus on that, even in the middle of a conversation, right? Just sort of get quiet. Okay. And it's also, I think, really important to not berate yourself for having that reaction. Because I
Mm.
think, especially as Christians, sometimes there's this misconception that boundaries and being a faithful Christian, someone who wants to give and to love, are mutually exclusive things. You can't sort of be loving and giving and charitable and have boundaries, and that is
Yes.
is completely false. You can't actually give love unless you have agency, right? Love, right?
Mhm.
Your will, basically, in a sense. Boundaries is just another way to talk about, shall we say, the sphere of influence of your choice, of your will. And so you can't love without freedom. And so boundaries is about
Mhm.
sort of setting limits on how much you are allowing someone else to enter into your sphere of freedom, into your
Mhm.
sphere of agency. And that's really important to sort of to building relationships. And so if you find yourself in conversation with someone, and I just really want to affirm and normalize this for anyone who's hearing this and thinking, oh yeah, that happens. One of the reasons we wanted to do this at this time, I know you and I talked about, Jillian, is that we're coming up to the holiday season. We're coming up to times when lots of family and friends are gathering, and maybe you're going to encounter people you don't encounter often, and you're okay with not encountering them often, right? Like you're encountering more challenging people. Like, let's just be real,
Yes.
right? You know, that whoever they may be, delightful and beloved of the Lord they may be, you're okay with not encountering them frequently, right? So we wanted to talk about this here about because it's normal to have these reactions. We all have preference. We all, and I think sometimes there's somehow a sense that it's not fair for us to set different boundaries with different people. And I just want to
Mhm.
explode that myth as well. It's 100% fair because preference is part of the human condition. We prefer spending time with other people, some people and not others. And so, there may be people in your family with whom your boundaries are more porous because they're safer people. Because
Mm.
when you have put up I'm not comfortable talking about that, they pat you on the back and say, no probs. I'm here when you're ready, if you're ever ready. But I love you. I'm here. No problem, right? And someone maybe in the same degree of relationship to you, instead of respecting that boundary, hammers at it,
Hmm.
right? Of
Hmm.
course, you're going to feel safer with the one who's being
Mhm.
respectful of the limit you have set on on their influence on your freedom. So,
Mhm.
I think it's really just want to affirm and normalize. This is tough stuff. It sounds abstract,
Yeah.
but we've all been in those situations where people are making comments or they're asking intrusive questions, and you know, I think there is almost this tug of war between I'm trying to be charitable and at the same time I need to be safe.
Yes. I'm so glad that you said that because I'm wondering if that tension between setting a boundary and being charitable is because I'm guessing this is for me, really, that I need to sometimes rewrite what my
Yeah.
definition of charity is. Because
Yes.
sometimes setting the boundary doesn't feel good. Like it doesn't
Yes.
feel nice or it doesn't feel loving, even if it is. I can
Mhm.
think of many, examples, and it wasn't received very well, or it felt maybe I could tell the other person wasn't feeling good about the boundary that was set. And so it didn't, the feeling, the emotion that came to me was not a good positive one, even though I
Mm,
knew that
love it.
what I said was what I needed. And so I'm wondering if you think that that might be the case for others too. Like this, we might have
Yes.
an idea of what charity
Mhm.
is, but we might need to kind of delve into that a little bit deeper so that we can set these boundaries.
Yes, 100%. I think that's so important. And that's wonderful that you brought that up because I do think that sometimes we think that the setting of boundaries, everyone is going to like sort of like set off one of those confetti rockets on your end and the other person's end, like, look at that glorious boundary, right? Right? No, that's often not what happens.
Ah,
It feels
dang.
deeply uncomfortable to
Yep.
reframe your sort of like to stake, in a sense, stake a claim of this is important to me and I need you to be here. I need you not to intrude beyond this point, right? And for the other person, especially, shall we say, if you are remaking boundaries that perhaps have been very porous before,
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
maybe this person has had something come up in themselves or in their life where all of a sudden they are being intrusive and now they're experiencing a hard stop from you. Nobody's going to be comfortable. And that's
Yeah.
loving. I mean, the verse honestly that came to mind when you said that is sort of like, Jesus saying to the Samaritan woman, I know you've had 7 husbands, right?
Yes.
Like that, talk about a hard stop, right? Like,
Yes.
yeah, that was a truthful thing to say. And I'm sure that's absolutely stopped her in her tracks, right? Like you are not going to, in a sense, con me with false statements about who you are because I know you and I love you, right? So that in a very real sense, it can feel deeply uncomfortable to reframe that. And so to start changing boundaries in a more healthy way, it kind of disrupts the homeostasis of relationships.
Yeah.
Often that's important because it's a dysfunctional homeostasis with an imbalance on one side or the other. And it's important, but it's really difficult, and I understand, please know as we're talking about this, everybody who's listening has all my compassion because it's really hard to sort of reform boundaries while everyone's like singing, rocking around the Christmas tree, right? And you're like, and drinking wine, opening gifts, and you're like, nope, hard stop. Like, Aunt Myrtle, you can't ask me those questions anymore, right? Like that's not an easy thing to do. Um,
Yeah.
and so, yeah, it's not going to feel comfortable, but it's really important. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that word uncomfortable. That's absolutely what I was trying to depict, this feeling of, of being uncomfortable, but right, there's, like you said, there's good reason for being uncomfortable, and it is loving to be able to set those so that those in our lives can respect us and approach us, and that we can continue having relationships with them, in accordance to whatever that relationship is. So I think to get, you know, maybe to get a little bit practical, or to get a little
Sure.
bit like, how do we figure out what our boundaries are, especially in a season of infertility, right? Our audience,
Yeah.
the listeners, have been asked the questions that you have brought up, the questions about, we do have some in our community who are longing for marriage, and a lot
Yeah.
of that the cross is similar there. A
Yes.
majority of our community is married and longing for a child, or another child for their children, and a whole mix, in between there, and to figure out like how to set them, what are they, what advice would
Mm.
you give, and maybe perhaps like for couples to
Yes.
discern
Mhm.
together, like how can they come together to kind of decide what's the best boundaries for them.
Oh, perfect. I think that's really, really important. It's important to sort of, I think, reflect individually and then come together and kind of have like a bit of a discussion about like, okay, where do our boundaries meet? Like, because I think
Sure.
sometimes, that can be really challenging when one person needs a firmer boundary set and then the
Hmm.
other person's like, but it's fine. They're just being sweet. And you're like, yes, but that sweetness is sort of really painful because they aren't respecting the fact that I don't want them to ask that as frequently or that we're not really talking about that. And so I think taking time to notice and reflect, what are the emotions that are coming up for me right now? Okay, as I'm approaching the holiday season, as I'm approaching the thought of all these gatherings, am I dreading something? Am I dreading questions? Okay, I'm dreading questions. Okay, are some of them going to come? Probably. Are there some, shall we say, for lack of a better term, likely culprits, right? Specific people or or groups
Yes.
from whom those are going to come. Yes. Okay. So, what can I do to ensure that my heart has a little space from maybe the intensity, the frequency, or the degree of intrusiveness? Okay. So, I literally, often I will have clients break out, a post-it note or something, or just draft a few choice phrases. And when I say choice phrases, I'm not using that word in a mean way, like, oh, these are going to be biting zingers. No, sometimes people do need a hard stop in front of them, especially if it's very clear that there's a pattern of boundary pushing over and over and over again. They're just steamrolling past things. Sometimes people do need a hard stop. They just won't hear it any other way. But most frequently, I think coming up with one liners that give you breathing room specific to your circumstance. So, to your point about maybe those in the community who are longing for marriage, right? Um, when, again, poor Aunt Myrtle, this hypothetical woman, right, says, oh, when are you going to find a man, or when are you going to find a good woman? Aunt Myrtle, that is a great question. I would so appreciate your prayers on that. And when she starts on, well, you should talk to my dentist nephew, or like some sort of rigmarole of that, like you think, literally excuse yourself. Oh, I see somebody else over there. Oh, got to go help mom check the turkey. Oh, I've got to do. You literally absent yourself. Make sort of generate a reason to leave the conversation. That is completely okay. It's completely okay because the person is not sort of reading the room. They're not respecting boundaries spoken or unspoken, right? And I think this is the most important part, and one of the hardest, I think, for people to hear when they're setting new boundaries. You are not responsible for someone else's emotional response to a boundary you
Mm.
set. You are not responsible for their emotional response to a boundary you've set. And if they try to make it your responsibility, you can say, sad you feel that way, not sorry. Do not say sorry. I'm sad you feel that way. You don't have to be sorry. It's not your fault. I'm sad you feel that way. And absent yourself from that conversation. Hmm.
Wow. That the not apologizing piece, I think, is one that I know I struggle with. I would imagine a lot of people do, because that,
Mm,
I think, when I sort of get the courage to be
yeah.
uncomfortable and to set that boundary, and then there's the response, I'm not always preparing myself enough. I think I'm not
Mm,
preparing myself ahead enough to be able
mm,
to not only say the uncomfortable thing, but then to sort of not like receive their response,
mhm.
but to like hear it and
Yeah.
respond if I need to, and like you said, excuse myself. I sometimes am a little short-sighted, I think, and forget to that there's likely going to be a response. And in my experience, right, it's an uncomfortable thing typically, and so the
Yeah.
response isn't always a pleasant one. And
Mhm.
so I appreciate this, just framing that I'm not responsible for that. We aren't responsible
No.
for other people's emotions, their responses, and not needing to apologize for it, and you can excuse yourself, from that. And I think it's so beautiful that this pause that you've been talking about. And we've talked about this in
Mhm.
other episodes too. I'm recalling the like shelving something,
Yes,
and
shelving
not,
agendas. Yes.
yes,
Yeah.
like
Mhm.
not, it's okay to not talk about something immediately. It's okay
Yes.
to pause, and that the wisdom, right, is there. And that I know is difficult for me to do, but I think like how beautiful for the both parties here to give an opportunity for that silence, for that pause, to be able to say, okay, I just said that. Like I set the boundary, I stood up for the things that I need to,
Mhm.
and the other party now can think about that. And
Yes.
we can go about peacefully, and I'm going to do this thing and help this person, and whether we talk or not again, by the end of the night, like we now have this pause. So I really appreciate that. And I can imagine, though there are some who are on the other
Mhm.
side of this podcast who are saying, what if they don't respect the boundary that I set? What if I've worked so hard to say the thing? I've set the boundary. They didn't
Mhm.
respond well. I didn't apologize, and they're still not respecting the boundary. They're sort of pushing me, like you had referenced at the beginning of this conversation. What do we do when that happens?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Um, so I liken it to sort of the experience of reasonable consequences for choices, right? You know, I think it's really okay to say, um, if there's a pattern of pushing, right? One push is sort of like, okay, I'm going to notice it. Two, okay, now I'm concerned there's a pattern. Let me confirm that with a, oh, three. Yep, absolutely. And that may be within the space of 5 minutes, right? You never know. And I really want to say, I'm sitting on the other end of this conversation, listeners who are listening to this and thinking, this is very easy to talk about in a safe space when Jillian and I and you are all listening in the quiet, right? When it's perhaps your mother-in-law, your sister-in-law, your own sister, your mother, your dad, when it's someone really close to you who is used to having access into inside your sphere of influence and like helping you shape choices, and all of a sudden you have like sort of closed a door, right? Or maybe it's a Dutch door. It's now half closed. And they're like, but I used to be able to walk right in, right? It is very jarring for you and for them. So that doesn't mean that because it's jarring, you can then like open the door. Oh, those poor things. Now they're having to navigate a boundary. Isn't that tough for them? No, but it's understanding that sometimes it may be repetition. Sometimes repetition of the boundary is what's required. Sometimes, though, there's somebody who is literally just operates through life like a steamroller. And if that's the kind of person you're dealing with, then you say, unfortunately, if you continue to ask the question I've asked you not to ask, if you continue to be intrusive, if you continue to make suggestions that I've told you before are not helpful, I won't be able to continue this relationship. I won't be able to because it's not safe for me. It's not healthy. Hmm.
Claire, I'm so grateful for your words, and I think I would need to maybe like practice these in a mirror or
Oh, 100%.
you know,
Yeah. Hmm.
with my spouse or
Yep.
but I'm so grateful too that you acknowledge that like this does get really not only uncomfortable, but you have these people who are really close to you where
Yes.
these relationships potentially could have quite a bit of a change in the
Yes.
format if that's what needs to happen. And that is hard, but hard doesn't mean bad,
No,
and
it doesn't.
to be able to recognize what those boundaries are. And I think, honestly, I like a good, I used to be an actor in high school, a little bit in college, and I love the practice. I love the dress rehearsal. Like give me the chances to make mistakes and to mess up and or
Hmm.
to like do really well and get some feedback on that. And the holidays I think are a great time to do that. That
Yes.
you get, yes, they also can be a tricky time because those likely culprits, as you were talking about, are going to probably be with us. But to sort of have maybe a few opportunities, I know that those that maybe I need to set boundaries with are often near me in the holidays. And so to be able to kind of practice and to be
Yes.
able to set those boundaries and to maybe get feedback from your spouse if they're with you and to or maybe you said it and it did really hurt and you apologize and to go back and say, okay, I don't want to do that, I don't want to
Yes.
apologize for that, to sort of give yourself space to practice setting the boundaries,
Yes.
I think is something I will definitely be doing. And I just appreciate all your words that you've said because it can be when you're in the moment, you can feel your face getting flushed and your heart is beating
Yes.
fast and
Totally.
you want to
Yep.
say the thing, but you don't know how it's going to go. And so to have some of these words to practice, on a sticky note, whatever it is, I think is
Yes.
so helpful.
Yes, drafting is really important. And, I say this all the time. I say this, my husband and I have two beautiful children through adoption, and they're 4 and 6, going to be 5 and 7 now, shortly. And one of the sort of funny call and responses in our house is, when the kids are upset that they're not getting a new skill perfectly, like riding a bike or something, I'm like, okay, what do we have to do before we're good at it? And they like roll their eyes and they're like, oh, be bad at it first. I'm like, yes, before we
Yes.
can be good at anything, we have to be bad at it. Isn't that great? Because we're going to
uh,
learn, right? So, and they think it's like, nauseating at this point how mom tries to make, the skill of learning like important. But it's really true. Like,
yep.
especially if you were not raised in a family where healthy boundary setting was a priority, where your parents really kind of worked maybe intentionally. Some people just intuit it, and God bless them because that's an amazing grace, right? Like just to know how to set healthy boundaries. Other people, like, their families weren't great at it because of trauma, because of, all kinds of other circumstances. And so they come to adulthood maybe with very, very rigid boundaries or very porous boundaries, and they have to relearn how to do this. And it's going to be a bit messy. And that doesn't mean that you're not doing it right. It means that you're literally learning a new skill, but it's a skill that's actually going to build communion, which is so funny. We think
Mm.
sometimes boundary setting is I'm putting a wall between me and someone else. It's like, no, you're putting up like a nice picket fence with a swinging butler door. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And it's a way to
Yes.
determine who's safe to let into your sphere of influence and who
Yes.
isn't. And it's really important because you can't have community without a shared sense of safety and trust. And I do think it's really important to talk about these things as a couple, especially
Mhm.
if you come from families where boundary setting was done differently. You sometimes, you can marry into a family where the parents expect to have a heck of a lot more agency in their adult children's decision making than your family did. Does that make sense? And sometimes that's a cultural aspect too. So you could have someone from like, hey, everybody is their sort of like own autonomous individual, great boundary setting, marry someone whose parents still really formulate many of their decisions for them. And that is like a whole different kettle of fish. So being on the same page as a couple, working to get on the same page as a couple, who needs a harder boundary? Who needs a softer boundary? Where do I maybe have to compromise a bit because my spouse needs a harder boundary with this person than I particularly need is really important. Having that kind of communication is crucial with your spouse.
Mm, that's so good. Listeners, I have lots more questions for Claire, and so don't worry because we're going to continue the conversation, but
Yay!
it's going to be next week. You're going to hear it next week. We're going to continue it, so don't worry. We've got lots more to share on the topic of boundaries. Claire, thank you so much for just really setting the stage and giving us a foundation about boundaries. And I can't wait to talk a little bit more about boundaries with you.
Oh, it's been a delight. Thanks so much, Jillian.
Yes. Listeners, if you are in a season where you're needing to set boundaries, if you're needing some help setting boundaries, let us know. We would love to be able to help you write those scripts, to be able to direct you to someone locally who could help you work through those and work with your spouse to set those. So just reach out. It's an honor to walk with you. We'll see you next week.